I've carried this around for years, and I don't really expect anyone to believe it. Maybe that's why I'm finally writing it down. My name's William, and if there's one thing I learned early in life, it's that not every scam looks like a scam. Sometimes it wears a tailored suit, smiles politely, serves expensive coffee, and calls itself an exclusive opportunity. The crime I keep replaying in my head wasn't a bank robbery or anything dramatic. No masks. No car chases. Just a fake auction where the winner had already been decided before the first paddle ever went into the air. I was one of the people behind it. At the time, I convinced myself it wasn't really stealing. I had a dozen excuses ready whenever my conscience started asking uncomfortable questions. Everyone involved was wealthy. Nobody was forced to bid. People loved the excitement more than the object itself. Those lies became easier to repeat every day. The truth was simpler. I wanted money. Not because I was starving. Not because I had no options. I just wanted to climb faster than everyone else, and I'd started believing that clever people weren't bound by the same rules as everyone else. Looking back, that's probably the first real crime, not the auction itself, but the moment I decided that being smarter somehow made me entitled. The auction was only the consequence of that decision. And once I took the first step, turning back became harder than I ever imagined. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to rig an auction. It started with conversations that sounded almost harmless. A friend of mine worked around collectors and private sales, and he casually mentioned how often buyers cared more about the thrill of winning than about the item itself. That idea stuck with me. If people were chasing the feeling, maybe the competition mattered more than the prize. From there, I became obsessed with understanding how legitimate auctions operated. I spent weeks studying catalogs, bidding etiquette, registration procedures, and the psychology of competitive buyers. I attended several events just to watch. I paid attention to who hesitated, who chased rivals, and who hated losing. The biggest realization was that perception was everything. If an event looked polished, most people assumed it was honest. That was when the line became clear. I stopped treating the idea like a thought experiment and started treating it like a project. Every small decision made the next one easier, and before long, I was planning something I knew crossed an ethical and legal line. The hardest part wasn't thinking up the scheme, it was making everything look ordinary. I learned quickly that people trust details. A professional-looking website, polished event invitations, neatly printed bidder cards, and a rented venue all created an atmosphere where nobody expected deception. The more authentic everything appeared, the less anyone questioned it. I spent weeks coordinating every piece. I recruited people who believed they were simply helping run an exclusive event, keeping their roles limited so no one understood the full picture. I rehearsed how registration would work, how the lots would be presented, and even how long the pauses between bids should feel. Every moment was meant to appear spontaneous, even though it had been carefully planned in advance. What unsettled me most was how quickly preparation became routine. At first, I felt nervous whenever I crossed another line. Then I stopped noticing. My focus shifted from whether I should be doing it to whether I had overlooked some tiny detail that might expose me. That change in my thinking should have frightened me more than it did. Looking back, it was the moment I realized how easily rationalization can reshape a person's conscience. By the evening of the event, everything looked exactly the way I had imagined it. Guests arrived dressed for what they believed would be an exclusive auction, chatting over drinks and admiring the items on display. Watching them mingle, I almost forgot how much of the evening had been carefully orchestrated behind the scenes. When the bidding started, the room came alive. Every raise of a paddle brought excitement, whispers, and the satisfying rhythm of the auctioneer's voice. Outwardly, it looked like genuine competition. In reality, the outcome had already been arranged before the first lot was introduced. I knew which bidder was expected to end up with the featured item, and every decision throughout the event quietly nudged things toward that result. Still, even the best plans never unfold perfectly. One guest became unexpectedly determined, continuing to bid long after most people would have stopped. The room grew tense, and I felt my heartbeat quicken. For the first time that night, I realized that no amount of preparation could completely control human unpredictability. The man who kept raising his paddle wasn't on anyone's radar. He hadn't attended the preview, barely spoke to the other guests, and looked completely uninterested during the first few lots. Then the featured item came up, and suddenly he transformed into the most determined person in the room. Every new bid chipped away at the carefully balanced script we had built. The predetermined winner glanced toward me more than once, silently asking what was happening. I couldn't answer without drawing attention, so I kept my expression neutral and hoped things would settle on their own. They didn't. The auctioneer, who believed everything was legitimate, simply did his job and accepted each higher offer. That was the problem with involving people who didn't know the full story. They reacted honestly, not according to the plan. Inside, I was doing mental arithmetic at an impossible speed. If the mystery bidder won, the entire arrangement would unravel. If we interfered too obviously, everyone in the room might sense something was wrong. For the first time that evening, I realized the illusion depended on dozens of strangers behaving exactly as expected, and one stubborn person was enough to put everything at risk. I had only a few seconds to decide how to respond, but panic has a strange way of stretching time. From the outside, I looked calm, standing near the side of the room with a polite smile, occasionally exchanging nods with guests. Inside, though, every possible outcome was racing through my head. The tension spread without anyone understanding why. The determined bidder seemed energized by the competition, while the person we expected to win grew visibly frustrated. Their confidence was fading, and I could almost read the question on their face: wasn't this supposed to be easier? I avoided eye contact with both of them. The last thing I wanted was to reveal that I cared who won. Instead, I busied myself with routine tasks, greeting late arrivals and answering harmless questions about the event. Every casual conversation became an excuse to stay composed. As the bidding continued, I realized something unsettling. The deception itself wasn't what threatened to expose me, it was my own reactions. People notice nervous behavior long before they notice missing pieces in a story. If I lost control of myself, the carefully crafted illusion would collapse long before the auction ended. The bidding finally slowed, but not for the reason I had hoped. The determined buyer suddenly stopped raising his paddle and asked to inspect the featured item one more time before making another offer. It was an unusual request, but not an unreasonable one. The room fell quiet as people waited for an answer. My stomach dropped. The display piece looked convincing from a distance, but I knew every extra minute of scrutiny increased the chances that someone would notice small inconsistencies. Nothing about it screamed fake, yet it wasn't exactly what people believed they were competing for either. The entire event relied on confidence and momentum. If either disappeared, questions would follow. The auctioneer looked toward me for guidance. I forced a smile and suggested a brief pause, pretending it was simply good customer service. A few guests appreciated the gesture, while others exchanged puzzled glances. Those seconds felt endless. As the buyer examined the item, I watched his face instead of the object. I wasn't trying to guess what he thought, I was trying to figure out whether he had seen something that could destroy everything I had spent weeks constructing. The buyer turned the item over in his hands with frustrating patience. He wasn't dramatic about it, wasn't trying to embarrass anyone, but he examined every visible detail as if he genuinely wanted to understand what made it valuable. Around the room, conversations faded into whispers. People who had been chatting moments earlier were now watching him instead of the auctioneer. Then he asked a simple question. "Do you have any paperwork showing its history?" It wasn't an accusation. It was the kind of thing any careful buyer might ask. Still, the words landed like a punch. I had anticipated plenty of scenarios, but somehow I had convinced myself nobody would request additional documentation in the middle of the event. I stepped forward before the auctioneer could answer. Keeping my voice steady, I explained that the supporting documents had been placed in a secure office and could be reviewed after the auction concluded. A few guests nodded, apparently satisfied. Others looked unconvinced but said nothing. The buyer studied me for a long moment before returning the item. He resumed his seat without another word, and the auction continued. Yet from that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone in the room had begun seeing through the performance, even if they couldn't yet prove why it felt wrong. Once the bidding resumed, the atmosphere had changed. The excitement was still there, but it was quieter, more cautious. People who had been throwing their paddles up without hesitation now paused before each bid, as if they were re-evaluating not just the item but the event itself. I could almost feel skepticism spreading from one table to another. The determined bidder raised his paddle only once more. The person we had expected to win immediately answered with a higher offer. A long silence followed. Every eye in the room shifted toward the challenger, waiting to see if he would continue. He didn't. The auctioneer counted down, brought the hammer down, and declared the predetermined buyer the winner. Applause broke out, though it sounded more polite than enthusiastic. Outwardly, everything had ended exactly as planned. If someone had walked in at that moment, they would have seen nothing unusual, just another successful sale. Instead of relief, I felt something heavier. The victory we had spent weeks arranging no longer felt like a success. It felt fragile. One unexpected bidder, one ordinary question, one extra minute of inspection had nearly unraveled everything. That realization stayed with me long after the guests began congratulating the winner and celebrating what they believed had been a fair contest. As guests drifted toward the reception area, the room relaxed in a way I couldn't. People laughed, compared the lots they had bid on, and congratulated the winner as though they had witnessed an exciting evening of honest competition. I smiled, shook hands, and thanked everyone for attending, but every friendly conversation felt like another performance. The buyer who had asked the difficult questions approached me before leaving. He wasn't angry or confrontational. In fact, he was almost disarmingly polite. He thanked me for the event and said he hoped to review the item's documentation another day. Then he looked me in the eye for a second longer than was comfortable and added, "It's always interesting to see how people build trust." That sentence echoed in my head long after he walked away. I couldn't tell whether he suspected anything or was simply making conversation, and that uncertainty was worse than a direct accusation. I replayed every moment of the evening, wondering if I had revealed too much through a nervous glance or an awkward pause. Sometimes the most dangerous consequences aren't immediate, they begin with a single doubt that refuses to disappear. The morning after the auction, I convinced myself the safest thing to do was act as if nothing unusual had happened. I answered emails, processed paperwork, and thanked attendees for coming, all with the same professional tone I had used before the event. On the surface, everything looked normal. Privately, I became obsessed with loose ends. I reviewed every document we had created, checking for inconsistencies that might raise questions later. I made sure records were organized, conversations matched what people remembered, and nothing pointed toward behind-the-scenes coordination. It wasn't about improving the scheme anymore, it was about reducing the chances that someone could connect separate details into a bigger picture. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent weeks planning the event itself, yet afterward I spent even more time worrying about ordinary things I had barely noticed before. Every unexpected phone call made my pulse jump. Every unfamiliar email address felt threatening. No one accused me of anything. No investigator knocked on my door. But fear doesn't always need evidence. Sometimes your own imagination becomes the most relentless detective, replaying every decision until you start questioning whether you overlooked the one mistake that will eventually catch up with you. Weeks passed, then months, and eventually life settled into something that looked normal again. From the outside, you would never have guessed that one evening still occupied so much space in my mind. Friends talked about work, vacations, and ordinary problems while I silently measured every conversation against the possibility that someone might mention the auction. They never did. That should have brought relief, but instead it left me alone with my own thoughts. I kept replaying tiny moments that nobody else would remember, the bidder asking for documentation, the brief silence before the final hammer, the way I forced myself to smile while my heart pounded. Those memories stayed vivid long after everything else faded. What surprised me most was that guilt didn't arrive all at once. It crept in gradually. At first, I only regretted how close the plan had come to falling apart. Later, I regretted putting strangers into a dishonest situation they never agreed to. Eventually, I stopped thinking about whether the scheme had succeeded and started thinking about the trust one had exploited. Once I saw it that way, the money mattered less than the damage I had chosen to ignore. People often imagine that getting away with something gives you confidence. In my experience, it did the opposite. It made me suspicious of everyone, including myself. If I could spend weeks creating a convincing illusion, I started wondering how many other people around me were doing the same thing in their own lives. I became more cautious, but not in a healthy way. I questioned innocent comments, read too much into casual conversations, and assumed ordinary coincidences carried hidden meaning. Every time someone mentioned auctions, collectibles, or dishonest business practices, my attention snapped toward them before I could stop myself. They were never talking about me, but my mind behaved as if they were. The strangest part was realizing that the person I distrusted most had become the one staring back at me in the mirror. I had always thought of myself as someone who occasionally made bad decisions. After that experience, I understood that bad decisions aren't isolated moments, they slowly shape your character if you keep defending them. That realization was harder to live with than any financial loss or public embarrassment ever could have been. Years later, I finally stopped telling myself convenient stories about that night. For a long time, I had described it as a clever business scheme that simply crossed a line. That version was easier to live with because it made me sound ambitious instead of dishonest. Eventually, though, I ran out of excuses. The truth was uncomfortable. I had taken advantage of people who walked into the room expecting fairness. Whether they lost money, time, or simply their trust in the process, I had helped create that outcome. The fact that everything looked polished and professional didn't make it less deceptive, it only made the deception more effective. I also realized how easily small compromises had led me there. None of my decisions felt enormous on their own. Each one seemed temporary, manageable, even logical. Only when I looked back did I see how those choices connected into something much bigger. That perspective changed the way I judged my own actions. Instead of asking whether I could avoid getting caught, I started asking a different question: what kind of person was I becoming every time I chose convenience over integrity? If you've made it this far, you might expect me to say the money wasn't worth it. That's true, but it's also incomplete. The real cost wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in peace of mind. For years, I carried the memory of that auction everywhere I went. Not because someone was chasing me, but because I knew exactly what I had done. Even when life looked normal, there was always a quiet voice reminding me that I had built something on dishonesty. You can ignore that voice for a while, but it has a habit of returning when everything else gets quiet. Looking back, I wish I had recognized how dangerous it is to justify small ethical compromises. They rarely stay small. One rationalization leads to another until you're defending choices that would have shocked your younger self. So here's my advice: if you ever find yourself thinking that deception is harmless because no one seems to notice, stop and walk away. The hardest person to fool in the long run is yourself. Once trust in your own character begins to crack, rebuilding it takes far longer than breaking it ever did.